Thank you very much. I think he's going to. Can you see me there? Can you? Have you got enough light?
No, who said that? Needs light.
He's going to need more light, he says. Otherwise it will just be a voice in the darkness. Yes, thank you very much for coming out on this dark and chilly night for an introduction to alchemy and the birth of modern science. This was a talk that was commissioned by somebody for a Shakespeare festival. They wanted to know a bit about what the alchemists were doing in Shakespearean times, and they just wanted 20 minutes or half an hour, and I was just so amazed by what I found when I started looking into alchemy that it turned into this talk. We start off with a picture. This is a picture that's familiar to most people, but it's a modern version of it. And the reason why I chose it is because it's a really brilliant metaphor for what alchemy is. When you ask people what they think alchemy is in the modern day, because we're taught to think in a very limited way about our ancestors, we tend to think only about the business of turning lead into gold, which of course is a pretty important thing to be able to do, and it is a thing we'll be looking at later on. But it's most of all, alchemy is a symbol for the perfectibility of the human spirit. And we perfect the human spirit by looking out and up. We know, as above, so below, as without, so within. The alchemists really understood this, and they were looking very, very hard at their world because they understood that what was going on was probably different from what they were seeing. And this character here, you can see that he's looking out on his world. Here's his kind of the world that he's used to, and it's got houses and trees and the sun and the stars and the moon and flowers, and it's a whole paradigm just like ours. And somehow, by experimenting with it and by looking upwards and outwards, he has revealed to himself that this is a kind of veil of illusion. And that's the kind of enlightenment that the alchemists were after. They weren't just looking out of making a bit of money on the side. They were really adventuring, and they were edge workers. They were wherever there was an edge. In these days, from probably we're talking from maybe 3,500 BC or before, these guys were on the edge. Before science arrived, we had alchemists. The meaning of the word is really unclear, and the orthodox people say that alchemy comes from alchemia, which means art of the black land. Black land, Chem, of course, is the ancient name for Egypt, and the Black Land is also Egypt. The name comes about because every year the Nile spreads a really thick, rich soil down itself as it flows right the way down through the country. And that black soil is thought to be where the name of the Black Land comes from. And art of the Black Land, alchemy is thought to have originated in Egypt. At least a lot of alchemical myth is centred around there, and is where the knowledge originally appears to have come from. Now that doesn't mean, of course, that was where it came from originally. It's just as far back as we can see. I actually prefer the more mythical or legendary definition of alchemy, though, rather than art of the Black Land. There's a tale that in history a race of giants married spirits, and that the offspring of this marriage were, if you like, stranded or exiled in the material world. These guys, the giants that married the spirits, were called the Nephilim in the Bible, or the Watchers, those who from heaven to earth came. And the offspring of the marriage between these giants and the spirits are said to have known a lot of stuff about electricity, about chemistry, about metallurgy, about astrology, about astronomy. And it's said that in the time whilst the Watchers were not watching, their offspring spread this information through the population, just giving this knowledge to anybody and everybody that asked for it. And not only are these guys in the Bible, Clement of Alexandria, who is taken as a reliable historian, he wrote of these teachers as the masters of metallurgy, biology, magic and astrology. And this is way back this is information that comes to the Roman or these historians from the dawn of history. Tertullian described this output as the teachings of fallen angels, and it's said that this knowledge was published originally in books called Chema. So alchemy may well come from the names of these books. And I think personally that's one of the most important clues. We're going to see that the alchemists are clearly on the right lines in many, many ways. It's just they've got a slightly mistaken tweak on it. It's like they're looking at something that's come to them not fully formed from the past.
Sorry, what books did you say? Alchemy comes from what books?
They would have been called, books are said to have been called Chema. If you give me your
C-H-E-M-A?
C-H-E-M-A. If you give me your email address at the end, I'll email you a copy of the notes for the talk, because not everything that's in the notes, there won't be time to talk about it all. So you can have the full thing unexpurgated by email or by post.
Well, all those sort of things that you've been saying about the teachers and the watchers is very similar to the dream and vision of the Book of Enoch.
That's exactly right, yeah. We don't have time to go into the Book of Enoch, but actually alchemy, there's a lot of alchemical stuff in Enoch, and that story is basically very similar to, well, it's part of the thought to be part of the Anunnaki story, which we obviously don't have time to go into here. So, but you're right, it is, that's exactly where it's tied in.
But you say the Nephilim, what
Sorry, can we keep questions to the end?
Sorry, sorry.
Thank you very much.
Am I the only one?
Yes, that's definitely, that's kind of where I think alchemy comes from. Control of the economy and information has been important to all manifestations of the world management team. And as a result, a Chinese emperor forbade production of alchemical gold as long ago as 144 BC. He tried to do it throughout the whole of China. It obviously worked really well, because about 40 AD another Chinese emperor also tried to ban alchemical works across the country. In our own country, Henry IV tried to prohibit all alchemical activity in Britain in the 1400s, but his successor Henry V positively encouraged the work of the alchemists in their laboratories. And it's perhaps somewhat cynically said that the reason he was doing that was because he had soldiers in the field in France, and you didn't really mind too much about the quality of the gold you paid them with, because of course you're trying to undermine the economy of the place that you're fighting in, as well as the place itself. This particular slide shows a particularly efficient manifestation of the world management team. These are Romans, the soldiers of the Emperor Diocletian, and they are burning Egyptian alchemical books and generally suppressing them and throwing them to the floor. Book burning, of course, is a major feature of history. When you look through it, you just find our books are being burnt again and again and again. But this is a way of maintaining control of information. If you want to make sure that you stay on top of the population, you make sure that if they're doing things that are giving them any kind of individual progress or inner satisfaction, you try and sit on them and prevent it. So, however we think of alchemy, it has always been a subject of huge interest to the people who are in power. As a result, alchemists kind of became used to getting themselves into a lot of trouble. It's really good that they got used to it, because every single one of them really did have a hard time, as we're going to see, especially the ones we've chosen for this talk. This has got several characters in it. This character up here is the Elector of Saxony, and he's called Nicholas II. And this chap here is an alchemist that he's torturing. And there's basically a piece of rope up here for dislocating his shoulder. There's something going through the back of his hands here, and they're also tweaking his legs, stretching him and generally pulling him apart. These are a bunch of guys who, pretty much like our recent governments, don't mind taking a bit of money for torturing a guy for information. So Nicholas II, he tortured a lot of alchemists. You don't make this much capital investment in all the kit unless you're going to, I guess. And one of the famous people he tortured was an alchemist called Alexander Seton. And he's one of many characters who is said to have managed to manifest the Philosopher's Stone, which we're going to look at in a bit of detail later. The only thing that saved Alexander Seton's life at the hand of Nicholas II was that Nicholas was worried that if he tortured him too much and killed him, that the secret of this transformation would die with him. So in the end, Nicholas kind of let him go a little bit. But not for nothing did Albertus Magus, who was one of the original, Albert Magus, he was a kind of dark age alchemist, so around 1200, 1100, he advised his fellow alchemists to avoid having anything to do with princes and noblemen. Very sound piece of advice, which every single one of the guys we're going to look at significantly ignores, alas for them. And whilst the church, this is government having a go, the church also really, really did not like the alchemists. And it never actually made it heretical for reasons which I don't quite understand. But one way or the other, it did actually, it did demonise alchemists and alchemy enough to make sure that nobody didn't even whisper the word when you were in the church. And one of the most famous British alchemists was a chap called Roger Bacon. He has got an absolutely astonishing life story. There's a book called Dr. Mirabilis by a chap called James Blish, and it's a novel. Effectively it's fictional, but the chief character in it, all the events in his life are based on the life of Roger Bacon. He was a Franciscan, and he was a champion of the scientific method. What that means is, up until the point when this guy came along, certainly in the West, it's not true elsewhere, but in the West, we had established the church and church dogma into our kind of governmental systems. And along with the church and Christian dogma came dogma associated with a character called Aristotle. Now, he was a brilliant man, and up until this point, people had looked out on the world and they'd had to deduce connections between what they saw outside or above and what they saw below. And they had to go, well, isn't that, you know, we can see 7 planets and there's 7 holes in the human body. There must be some sort of connection here. And by that sort of thought process, they established a really complex cosmology. And that Aristotelian cosmology became established with the church cosmology, and it became just as impossible to question. So for many hundreds of years, this logical Aristotelian idea of the way the world was embedded with the church, and to argue with Aristotle was heresy. Now, what started happening with people like Dr. Mirabilis here is that he started writing the stuff down and going, well, we can measure that. We can have a go at setting up an experiment and seeing if this idea we've got is true. So he started to, and of course what this does is it starts showing that some of the Aristotelian ideas are not quite correct. So that's why he's said to be one of the first scientists. He actually nearly blew himself into the River Thames at one point because he discovered gunpowder. And of course if you discover it and you don't know what it is and you try to